know, on the 24th of February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. And this is not to say that the invasion started the war. In fact, the war in Ukraine was ongoing, has been ongoing, and affecting thousands of lives since 2014. But this is also not to say that the invasion did not have an effect. It was, of course, a major escalation of violence that forced millions of Ukrainians, 1/3 of the country's population, out of their homes. But it also had profound ripple effects, both in Ukraine and globally. So just to illustrate, the number of Google searches for the term Ukraine skyrocketed the night after the invasion. And that shows something else that has happened. The way that we talk, that we think, the narratives around peace and security, the international alliances around security have shifted and reshaped as a result of that invasion. And Ukrainians, and especially Ukrainian women, have been at the forefront of adapting to those changes. From reshaping their work and their lives to support those fleeing the war and the violence in neighboring countries like Poland, where I am from, or in Ukraine itself, to engaging in discussions and trying to ensure that their voice is not lost. And so during that time, and especially in the months following the invasion, there was also a lot of confusion, disbelief, and hopelessness. And amidst all this chaos, and amidst that pain, one question stood clear, and that is peace in Ukraine possible? And if so, what would peace in Ukraine look like? So as you've heard, my name is Agnieszka. I am not Ukrainian. I have worked with women and men peace builders in Ukraine and around the world in nearly 20 different countries for many years. And indeed, back in 2018, we've worked with Ukrainian colleagues, with colleagues in other countries, to conduct this global study answering exactly the question that is animating also our discussion today. What is peace? Right? And it seems very broad, but it's also very deep. And one thing that came very clear from those discussions, from that research, is that, of course, there is no one simple, straightforward answer to the question, right? Peace means different things to different people, but perhaps even more importantly, what peace is, what peace means, is forged, is born out of dialogue. It's born out of those difficult conversations, those disagreements even, between those that are the most concerned by peace, that are the most affected by violence. So I am not Ukrainian, and I do not stand here today to prescribe or define what peace means or should mean in the context of Ukraine. Rather, I stand here to share some reflections and experiences based on my years of experience since the beginning of the war, of working and learning from Ukrainian women and men peace builders, but also more recently from conversations with good colleagues at the Ukrainian platform of dialogue or community of dialogue practitioners. So it is my privilege to stand here at their behest, again, not to define what peace is in Ukraine, but rather to make sure that those difficult conversations and those important experiences and those important voices do not get lost on our minds and on our agendas. So what does peace mean in Ukraine? That question and the issue of peace has been a contentious one, a difficult one, a divisive one in Ukraine long before the 2022 full-scale invasion. And this is unsurprising, given the country's complicated history and given its geopolitical position, with an imperialist power quite literally breathing down its neck. And I remember working with Ukrainian feminists several years ago who felt uncomfortable, who viewed with suspicion the global feminists' calls for demilitarization and reducing military spending. That's not to say they opposed it, but they did view it with suspicion. And indeed, since 2022, it became very clear that for many Ukrainian activists, including those working for peace, it is not appropriate and it is not helpful to call for demilitarization or end to military assistance. But what I want to bring attention to today is that to not call for a halt or reduction in military assistance does not mean to forego dialogue. And indeed, dialogue has been and continues to be a central tool and a central avenue towards peace for many Ukrainians. Ukrainian government and its international partners have been engaging in dialogue and humanitarian dialogue to secure safe passage of aid or the release of prisoners since the beginning of the war, and especially since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And the Ukrainian peace builders have been putting in enormous efforts to also foster internal dialogue in Ukraine. And these efforts have been largely invisible. They have been lost from the conversations and discussions of what peace means in Ukraine. But they are no less important, because peace is built not only across fault lines or country borders, it is also built internally in any context, regardless of the nature of the war. Because once the guns fall silent, as surely they will one day, it is the strength and the resilience of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian society that will allow to build peace that is more than an absence of war. A peace that is rooted in values of humanity, of care, and of solidarity. And Ukrainians have shown this solidarity over and over again in responding to the war, in supporting each other, caring for each other, again, reshaping their lives to support those fleeing the violence. But like in any society, those values of humanism, of care, they are put to a harsh test in conditions of war. They need to be nurtured, they need to be maintained. This task of dialogue, of speaking to each other, of nurturing that care, is not one that can wait for a better, calmer time. It is a task that is urgent, and it has to happen, has to continue to happen today, even as the bombs continue to fly. And it is a task that many Ukrainian activists have taken upon themselves. And we owe it to them to recognize these efforts, to support them, and to acknowledge that yes, peace in Ukraine is possible. And yes, it can be reached through dialogue. But that dialogue might not fit the imaginaries of the international community. It might not look like what we wish a dialogue, a peace dialogue, would look like. It has to be determined and defined and conducted on the terms of the Ukrainian people. And so that means that the question today is not only, is peace in Ukraine possible? Or what does peace mean? But also whose peace is being built or will be built in Ukraine. And so before concluding, I want to also leave you with another question, and that is also whose recovery will we support, whose recovery will be promoted and supported in Ukraine. And economic recovery, unlike dialogue, has been on top of the headlines when it comes to Ukraine. But the everyday efforts, the arduous everyday work that it takes to make such recovery possible has not been on the headlines. I am working with some wonderful colleagues from Ukraine, from Kharkiv, from Lviv, and also internationally, to conduct a project, a research and policy project that looks at the path towards Ukraine, towards recovery in Ukraine. And one thing that is abundantly clear that we are noticing over and over is that while the recovery requires that everyday work of building relationships, sustaining relationships, keeping children, families, and communities alive, the discussions, the international discussions on economic recovery still continue to predominantly center on economic growth, largely ignoring that other side of the recovery. So whose peace and whose recovery are the questions I will leave you with today. I have no answers. The answers should not come from me, but I do have some wishes. I think it is perhaps in this kind of solidarity and care that I spoke about that we can find the seeds for peace. So I wish that we continue to find that solidarity for the Ukrainian people and for others who are facing the horrors of war. I wish that we also find it in our hearts and in our minds to build peace that is not based on predefined notions, but rather on difficult conversations. And finally, for tonight, I wish that we hope that we leave this room with minds full of inspiration, hearts full of solidarity, and hands ready to work. Thank you.